Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Queensland Election Environment Debate. My name is Ben Smee. I'm with Guardian Australia, and today I'll be facilitating a forum that discusses Queensland's environmental priorities with the key environment spokespeople from the major parties.
Can't hear you, Ben.
Oh, sorry. Are we? Can't hear. Just heard. Sorry, I'm off mute here. Okay, I'm getting some messages that people can hear, so hopefully we're all good. So we've got the key environment spokespeople from the major parties, from Labor, the Minister Leeanne Enoch, from the LNP David Crisafulli, and from the Greens Michael Berkman. To start off, though, I'd like to introduce Senior Traditional Owner Auntie Deborah Sandy for a welcome to country.
Here we go, we're off. Oh yeah, and now we're on. Okay, Jingawalu everybody. My name is Deborah Sandy. I'm from the Chepara people of the Great Southeast in Queensland. I am from the Magunchin clan, tribal people of Magunchin, that is Brisbane. On the south side, I'm from the Urongapan clan group. I'd like to acknowledge my ancestor, Megan Bungaree of Magunchin, CBD, heart of Brisbane. Yagara Yugurpo is our language. We are young language speakers of this great nation. On south side, I would like to acknowledge ancestor Bilimba of the Urongapan. Also, I'd like to acknowledge my mother and her country and people. We are the Wandjambara from Mount Tamborine. We are Yugambeh speakers from there. On behalf of the Chepara people of the Great Southeast, Deborah Sandy here, welcome each and every one of you here to this Zoom meeting webinar from Brisbane, Jingawalu, Ngudnam, Mugwai. To all the Jabus, that's the men. To all the Jundals, that's the ladies. Wiboka, welcome. And on behalf of the Chepara people, I'd like to acknowledge and say thank you for everybody for including us in this great debate. And may all you people here do what's right and best for our country, to take care and to preserve for all time. And thank you very much. And I hope that the state and the people who are handling and taking care of matters on country, with country, please do your very best to keep the country the way it was for 65,000 years, and to respect the dreaming and also the customary traditional landowners with the utmost respect for all time, as sovereignty never ceded here and these lands were stolen. So on behalf of the Chepara people, Wiboka, welcome. And for all of you who get confused with such things and matters with just one thing, I'd like to acknowledge that our people here do have a book. If we can get that video to keep going again, I'd just like to spread the word and message that the Stephen Shire History Group have put a small piece of our history into their history book. So with people who are confused with other names and words around town, such as Turrbal. Turrbal does not exist here. The Turrbal people here in Turrbal Point, I like to get the message loud and clear to people. That's a point opposite Bribie Island. The Turrbal people, or the Ningi Ningi, used to actually fight and battle with our people here of the Magunchin clan. So this here is my traditional homelands. And yes, I was born in Brisbane and I lived on the same country for all of my life, Magunchin. And I like for people, including the state, to respect that for all time. And if anybody likes to buy a book, see if we can get that video up there and that. Just get in contact with the people who put this seminar on. And this is the book. It goes up the Stephen Shire History Group. If anybody who's confused with such matters, you can read everything in this book about who the traditional people are of the homelands of Magunchin. So on behalf of the Chepara people, welcome, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Auntie Deborah. And on behalf of our speakers and viewers today, I want to extend my acknowledgement to you for that welcome and pay my respects to your elders past, present and emerging. Welcome again to everyone today. Together, the co-hosting organisations here have more than 250,000 supporters in Queensland. I'm told we have about 400 people online at the moment. So that's fabulous and a really good reflection of how important nature protection is to Queenslanders. So the format today is going to include an introduction from the Queensland Conservation Council and then opening addresses from each of our panelists, followed by a question and answer session. We received so many suggestions from supporters from today's debate, more than we can possibly cover in an hour, which is very unfortunate. But we've tried to sort them into themes and determine which ones to ask. But if your question doesn't get answered, I'd really encourage you to write to your local MP and each of these panelists to pose those questions directly. For everyone watching, you can also join into the debate as well by adding your comments or questions in the comments section, but I'd ask you to please keep those respectful. Today's event is co-hosted by an impressive coalition of environmental organisations working to protect nature in Queensland: the Australian Marine Conservation Society, the Australian Conservation Foundation, the Wilderness Society, Our Living Outback, WWF Australia, and the Queensland Conservation Council. We're first going to hear from a representative of these organisations, the Queensland Conservation Council's Dave Copeland. So over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Ben. G'day, everyone. I'm Dave Copeland, the Campaign Manager of Queensland Conservation Council. I work for QCC because I believe addressing climate change and protecting our citizen environment is the most important thing I can do as a Queenslander, as a father, and as a citizen. I'm proud that QCC is part of this coalition of environment groups organising today's debate. This debate is important. We're at a critical time in our state's history. We've seen catastrophic floods and bushfires, blistering heat waves, 3 devastating bleachings of the Great Barrier Reef, severe drought that has devastated farming and bush communities. Climate change is harming Queenslanders right now. The Bureau of Meteorology yesterday released a severe weather outlook for summer, predicting an increased risk of flooding for Eastern Australia and increased tropical cyclones for the north. Now, this matters, and Australians are the highest per capita emitters of greenhouse gases if you exclude the petrostates of the Gulf. When the emissions from Australia's current coal, gas, and oil exports are added to domestic emissions, our contribution to the global climate pollution footprint is 5%. That's 15 times our share of the world population. This is an indictment, but it's also an incredible opportunity, as almost nowhere in the world has the same potential to change, to reduce global emissions as right here in Queensland. We have the technology, we have the science, we have the community support to change this. 65% of Queenslanders say climate change is a personal problem to them. Business sentiment is moving to clean, green energy, and investors are demanding climate change impact statements. We just lack the political leadership we need to take the action we need and reach net zero before 2050. We also face an extinction crisis. Queensland has more plant and animal species than any other state in Australia. I know how lucky I feel when I head over to Menjarabah and I can show my kids the whales, the dolphins, the turtles, the rays, the koalas and kangaroos, and we see them all in a weekend. Sadly, 955 species in Queensland are listed as threatened. Deforestation and land clearing is the greatest threat to native species in Queensland, and over the 8 years from 2010 to 2018, Queensland has cleared 2.5 million hectares of forest, 70% of all land cleared nationwide. Now, there is an attitude that politics in Queensland is different, and it's definitely true. We don't all fit the straw man cliche that the reactionary commentators present of inner city greenies. But we love our outdoors, our nature, our forests, our waterways, our reef, and our wildlife. Through COVID, Queenslanders have rekindled this love affair with our gorgeous natural treasures, with national parks visits through the roof. And through our history, we've been prepared to fight to defend them, whether it's the Daintree, Fraser Island, or the Reef, preserving the spaces we now all enjoy. I'd love to hear in the chat from everyone, what do you love about the environment? And what do you want the Queensland government to do to protect it? What Queenslanders have demonstrated through the COVID pandemic is when we face an urgent crisis and there is leadership based on science, that we can pull together, we can help each other, and we are prepared to make extraordinary sacrifices for the common good. All we need to know is that we're in it together. We have a plan to make sure everyone's supported and leadership we trust. I imagine that the hundreds of people joining us today or watching this debate later tonight share my dream that we'll see this same type of leadership that has protected us from COVID brought to the challenges of climate and nature. Today, we ask 3 political leaders, all committed to public service, how will they provide this leadership for all of Queensland? And as an environment movement, we're prepared to play our part. We will model this today with the same spirit of healthy debate and Zoom comments. We're moderating the chat and won't hesitate to kick out anyone attacking a person over their ideas or spamming messages, so you've been warned. We don't have time for division or point scoring. We need real leadership right now. And that's what I hope we'll hear today. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks very much for that, Dave. Now, today we're joined by the Minister for the Environment and the Great Barrier Reef, Leeanne Enoch, the opposition spokesperson for the Environment, David Crisafulli, and the Greens MP for Maiwar Michael Berkman. First, we're going to hear from each of our MPs. They're going to introduce themselves, talk about their priorities, and then a little later we're going to dive into questions. So I might ask the Minister, Leeanne Enoch, to jump in first, and I would ask everyone to attempt to limit your responses to 5 minutes for this section. Hello, Minister, how are you?
Very good. Thank you so much. Yura Nyare Gurajan Tabalban Minjuraba Mugampan Naraba Bajabaru Wanyayi Yura Nya Gurajan Jagajan Yagara Yura Nyali Jagajan Maramba Balga Yarigana. Can I just say hello? I'm a saltwater Aboriginal person from Minjuraba Mugampan. I acknowledge our ancestors, present and past, and also the Yagara people of their country, of which I'm situated currently. And I welcome, of course, the good spirits to our conversation today. Can I also acknowledge Deb Sandy for her welcome to country and thank her for that. And of course, the other speakers that are with us today, David and Michael, for taking their time to be part of this as well. Well, of course, we've heard a little bit about COVID-19 and many of us have been very much impacted by that. And we know that the Palaszczuk government's strong health response has been able to put us in a position where we are able to start delivering our plan for Queensland's economic recovery. And of course, as you already heard from Dave, there's this great opportunity, this potential for economic recovery projects to be delivered that also produce strong environmental outcomes. And now more than ever, I think more and more Queenslanders have become more attuned to our great outdoors, our great natural assets, because of our ability to be more hyper-local and connect to our local environments. That's why already through our economic recovery plan, we've already announced $8.9 million with regards to the National Park Works and Jobs boost, which is on top of the $45 million in revitalising national parks that has seen infrastructure upgrades across our national park estate. The $10 million Reef Assist Fund, which was looking at funding for land management projects in reef catchments, and our $10 million Skilling Queenslanders for Work project to increase work skills traineeships in construction, conservation and land management projects. And of course, this is against a backdrop of our strong record on environment. Even in this term, as the Minister for Environment, there's been a massive number of achievements that we've been able to make. We've seen an investment of some $340 million, a record investment in protecting the Great Barrier Reef. On top of that, we established and passed legislation to protect the Great Barrier Reef through our reef regulations. We released just recently the Queensland Protected Area Strategy with a $60 million down payment on this 10-year strategy, which included, which I'm very proud about, the doubling of Indigenous land and sea ranges across the state, bringing the total number to 200 now. We developed and released the Southeast Queensland Koala Conservation Strategy, bringing forth the strongest koala protections this state has ever seen. We implemented the incredibly successful container refund scheme, which has seen over 2 billion containers returned so far, and we're just hitting the 2-year mark of the scheme. It has supported over 700 jobs, a great indication of how environmental projects, such as a container refund scheme, can also support jobs. We established the nation-leading $500 million land restoration fund, and almost $100 million of projects have already been announced out of that fund. We banned single-use lightweight plastic bags in this state, and we introduced legislation to ban single-use plastics in Queensland, starting with straws, stirrers, plates and cutlery. We established new mine rehabilitation laws, including the establishment of a mine rehab commissioner. We fixed the LNP's terrible tree clearing laws and ended broad-scale tree clearing in this state. We've investing $100 million in recycling and resource recovery infrastructure, which will create jobs and reduce landfill. And we've committed $500 million to establish a clean energy fund and a $145 million for 3 renewable energy zones. And of course, that's all part of our pursuit of our target of zero net emissions by 2050 and 30% emissions reduction by 2030. And of course, our target of 50% renewables by 2030. And today, you know, the other thing that I can also mention is that a re-elected Palaszczuk Labor government will deliver a climate action plan for 2020 to 2030 to map out our actions for the next decade. The plan will guide the next stage of our post-2020 climate pathway. It will include, or could include, actions to reduce emissions, industry roadmaps and initiatives, sustainability initiatives, community and local government grants, and of course, over this term of government and since the Palaszczuk government has come to office, we've had a strong record on climate action, and this will be our next step. The delivery, if re-elected, the delivery of a climate action plan for the next 10 years. Thanks, Ben. I'm very proud of our record. I'm very proud to have been the Environment Minister over this term, to have delivered all of those, plus the huge list that I won't name now, given that we've got a limited amount of time. And the list is long, let me tell you. And the fact that today we can also announce that we will start work on the climate action plan that will guide us for the next 10 years around our actions on climate change. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks very much, Minister. I'm just having some trouble starting my video back up. I don't know if I've been...
Well, I could keep going with the big long list if you like.
That's fine. Look, I'm back. So thanks very much, Minister. We might now hear from the opposition spokesman for the environment, David Crisafulli. David, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And Deb, thanks for your welcome, and also to you, Minister, for yours, and Michael for your time, and everybody on the line. If COVID has shown us anything, it's how important the environment is to our state. And quite frankly, the point of difference that it gives us. Our reputation will be built on clean and green, wide open spaces. And that's great for our legacy. It's equally great for economic opportunities. And I think to the credit of many of the groups who have been involved in putting this on, and the members who are part of it, you have done a mighty job of mounting a case in recent months about how that economic revival could occur by using that natural environment. In fact, it will be a point of difference when it comes to people choosing where they want to live. The world has changed forever, and that environment and that reputation gives us an economic point of difference as well. I want to briefly talk about the style of department I would like to run as the Minister for Environment. My style is one on consultation. I'm not someone who dictates, and I would like to think my history as local government minister showed that. It was never about command and control. It was always about allowing people to make a decision at a grassroots level. That will be my style as the Environment Minister. The Environment Department will be a senior one, and it will work with tourism hand in hand to deliver an ecotourism strategy that doesn't just protect the environment, but enhances it and creates long-term sustainable jobs. It will be no one's wallflower. If something is environmentally significant and protection is a must, it will stand firm. Where things need to occur, it will set those parameters, and it will do it without fear or favour, and it will be a department that the people who work for can be proud of going to work every day and setting those targets and that agenda. I want to talk about first and foremost what I think is our one target that we must strive for over and above everything else, and that's around protected areas. And there's been a lot of talk about that, and quite frankly, we've missed the mark. We as a state signed on to a target through UNESCO, and that target was 17% of protected areas, and we aren't even at double digits, and that is the first deadline that's been missed. Now, I will always say that both sides of politics have done things they should be proud of and have done things that they shouldn't be proud of. But the one legacy point that I want to point to was between 2012 and 15 under Andrew Powell's watch as Environment Minister. That is the only time in a term of government over 1 million hectares has been protected. Is that enough? No. But it was the best of the benchmark, and we've got to get back to that. And in fact, we have to exceed that. That is a legacy we must do for future generations. And it's not about locking it up. It's about protecting it. It's about working with landholders to better their product. It's about making sure we draw a line in the sand with koalas in areas, particularly in places like the Northern Gold Coast, where bad planning has led to a species that may not be there in an entire area if we don't act and act swiftly. Ben, before I go back to you, I just want to outline something really clearly, because I know this is something that many people today want to hear. The LNP will not be reinstating the vegetation management laws of 2013. Let me be very, very clear. That is going to be on the table, and so anyone who says that Category R will go, that is incorrect. That will be retained, and that is, of course, those buffer zones. Category A, when it comes to the transfer of land for those areas, that will be retained. The elements of that legislation that we would like to be improved include allowing the farmer to be able to have a simplified process when it comes to feeding starving beasts in the time of drought, and I talk about mulga specifically there. Changes will be made in consultation. That will be my style. I look forward to working with the groups who are here today, your membership, and indeed everybody who wants to see Queensland be the sort of state that we all want it to be.
Thanks very much, Shadow Minister. And now I'd like to welcome Michael Berkman from the Greens. And if you'd like to go away with your opening statement.
Thanks very much, Ben. Look, I want to begin as well by thanking Auntie Deb sincerely for her welcome. I'm here in Indooroopilly in the electorate of Maiwar, so I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which I'm standing here and across Queensland's land and waters. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and recognise that their sovereignty over this country has never been ceded. Thank you sincerely to the organisers, to everyone who's here to participate, especially the Minister and the Shadow Minister. Thanks for taking the time. Look, I guess I want to start off by just identifying that I'm here. I got into politics after working for a number of years as a lawyer, helping farmers in rural communities fight against big coal mining projects, and working to see climate change properly addressed in the assessment and approval of Queensland's massive resource projects, particularly fossil fuel projects, and also to fight for the protection of the Great Barrier Reef under our state and federal laws. And through that work, I saw firsthand just how ineffective this system of environmental laws is. And I saw that for the communities and advocates who are fighting to protect our natural environment here in Queensland, the system was stacked against them extraordinarily. So no matter how hard they tried, and no matter how dangerous the project might have been for groundwater or for climate, they came up against the same problem. And that problem is essentially that Queensland's environmental laws and Queensland politicians have, as far as I know, never ever refused a coal mining or a fracking project. You know, our state and federal environmental laws don't even allow for consideration of the climate change impacts, the full extent of those climate change impacts of some of the biggest fossil fuel projects in the world. You know, those projects that Dave referred to before, that together make up our extraordinary contribution to global emissions, you know, at 5%, including our exported emissions. So I could see, as so many can, that this, you know, the way the state was going was literally driving us off a cliff. You know, with catastrophic global warming, extinction and loss of native forests bearing down on us, everyone continued to carry on just as normal. And these are the very issues that drove me to get into politics, and the reason that I'm here addressing you today. Now, in my first term as an MP, I've prioritised stamping out the influence of big polluters on politics. First of all, with a bill to ban corporate donations. I've also focused specifically on stopping the Galilee Basin coal mines, including Adani, because we know that to have any kind of safe climate future, we simply can't keep digging up new fossil fuels. We certainly can't afford to open up the biggest untapped thermal coal basin in the world. Now, this election, the Greens are putting forward a fully costed plan to create thousands of good, secure jobs and to fully fund public health and education. And to fund that by making big corporations and banks and developers pay their fair share in tax. Now, instead of freezing mining royalties for big corporations like both Labor and the LNP have proposed, we are pushing to raise them. And it's because we think all Queenslanders should share in our state's mineral wealth to build a better future. Now, we're the only party, I would argue, in this election that's running on a credible plan to tackle the climate crisis and the growing extinction crisis. And I believe we can do that only because we're the only party that doesn't take donations from the fossil fuel industry. Now, as we recover from the economic shock caused by COVID-19, we should be seizing this opportunity to completely reshape our energy systems and to regenerate our natural assets and make Queensland a fairer place. The plan we've put forward would create more than 70,000 jobs by building 100,000 new social homes and 100% publicly owned clean energy by creating the foundations for a green steel industry in Gladstone and publicly owned clean energy manufacturing plants in Townsville and Rockhampton. Now, those are just a few highlights of what we think we can bring to Queensland if we just even things out between the community and those big corporate interests that have been served by governments in Queensland for far too long. Anyway, thanks for that, Ben. I'll throw back to you and look forward to the questions.
Thanks very much, Michael. We're up to about 600 people on the video now, so that's fabulous. So plenty of people interested in hearing from our representatives about what they're likely to do. I'm going to move into some question and answer format now. We are running very slightly behind time, so if I could ask our panelists to do what they can to try and limit their answers or keep them as short as possible. I'll be sort of jumping in around the 2-minute mark if we go a little bit longer. But we're going to sort of mix up the order a little bit. So I might ask the Shadow Minister, David Crisafulli, to jump in and take this question first. But if you can all put your video back on, we're going to get to each of you. You'll each have the opportunity to answer. So starting with you, Shadow Minister, polluting agricultural runoff is the biggest threat to the Great Barrier Reef after climate change. To tackle this problem, the Queensland government passed reef water quality regulations, which require farmers to meet minimum practice farming standards. Will the LNP retain the current regulations, including current minimum farming standards, and will it commit to new funding to improving water quality on the reef?
Ben, the answer to the question is we're not only going to ensure the best environmental outcomes with a sustainable agricultural industry, but we're going to put it in legislation. And that will end the political argy-bargy that we're seeing at the moment. Now, no matter how we cut it up, the legislation that went to the Parliament a few months ago sets nothing more than the power for those regulations to be done by an unelected official, and that can be subject to any political argy-bargy. That means that without it ever going back to a Parliament, an unelected bureaucrat could decide to make the laws far tougher or far weaker. Now, I would rather say let's legislate it. Let's take a set of standards that are fair and reasonable. I want to see viable agricultural industries. I also want to see an environment that my kids and their kids can enjoy. And the two can occur and it can exist. And by legislating, by consulting properly, I have every confidence we can do that and end the political argy-bargy that happens every time governments change.
Just to be clear, Minister, are you talking about, is the LNP going to roll back any of the regulations that Labor put in place?
We are going to legislate, and the legislation will be done in consultation with all of the environmental groups and indeed the agricultural groups. And I have every confidence that we can find a set of standards that give the certainty for both sides of the debate to go forward. And at the moment, as I said, it's been nothing more than given a blank check across. And I think that's dangerous in the current political mix. That's dangerous whichever way you look at it.
I'm going to throw to the Minister here quickly. Sorry to leave you last again on this one, Michael, but I think, Minister, your kind of response here, obviously those regulations were brought in by your government, but no party's committed to them being funded post July 2022. And it's pretty clear that in terms of speaking to scientists and those working around the reef, that there is plenty more that needs to be done. So what's Labor going to do in the next term of government to protect the reef?
Well, first of all, can I just be really clear that, we back science in this state. The Palaszczuk government has always backed the science and the reef science. What we've seen recently has been a full-on attack on reef science in this state. We had a Senate inquiry that tried to undermine peer-reviewed published science, that attacked scientists and undermined their work. The establishment of the reef regulations, reef protection regulations, took place after 2 years worth of consultation with all stakeholders. It was legislation that went through the House and then through a committee process that brought us to the point of regulation. That has been years of work to ensure that we have the strongest protections we can that are fair to all. And that consultation was absolutely comprehensive. And it was based on peer-reviewed published science. It was based on reef science that has been credibly backed in by a number of reef scientists right across our state, right across our country. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is that the reef protections have been backed in by a record $340 million worth of funding to support the work that we've been doing, particularly around water quality. They are the strongest levers that we can pull as a state government is around water quality. And that's why we've invested so much in that space, including in terms of reef regulations, $10 million to support the agricultural sector to be able to meet the requirements of their regulations. Keeping in mind that the regulations through consultation are based on industry's own best management practice, those levels that you'd expect that every single body, agricultural body, would be supporting, because that's what they already are trying to reach with their members. So it's a very fair set of regulations that has been brought about by legislation that has been consulted on for over 2 years and based on science, peer-reviewed published science, not attacked by the LNP through a Senate inquiry, not attacked in a way that they wanted to establish a Office of Science Quality Assurance, where they could pick and choose which science they would use, based on peer-reviewed published science, credibly backed in by scientists in this state, and regulations that are fair and that have been supported through our record investment into the Great Barrier Reef.
What's next, though, Minister? We know that the situation with the reef is, relatively critical, that there are a number of things that we need to be doing quite aggressively to try and improve the health of the reef. Does Labor have a plan for another set of actions in the next term of government?
Yeah, well, certainly we know, and particularly through COVID, more and more people have become even more in tune with the value of the Great Barrier Reef. We only have to look at the impacts of COVID-19 on our tourism industry to know how much many more people have now, put their attention to the protection of the Great Barrier Reef. So, of course, we'll continue our work with the federal government. We are in partnership with them with regards to the work that we do around protecting the Great Barrier Reef. And we'll continue that work knowing that we have particular levers that we're able to pull, and that's around water quality, and we'll continue to defend our reef regulations, something that Mr. Crisafulli actually brought a disallowance motion to the House to remove those protections. We'll continue that work, and of course, we'll continue that partnership with the federal government as we lay out the plans beyond 2022.
And Michael, do the Greens have a particular plan for the reef and addressing water quality issues?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've been very supportive of the steps that have been taken to improve reef water quality, but this is an issue where we really have watched successive governments from both Labor and the LNP really struggle and quite, certainly till this point, just fail to reach the long-term targets that we need to see met to improve water quality for the reef. And in some of those catchments, we're miles away from hitting safe levels of pollution to see the reef protected. So, I mean, we strongly support a strengthening, the toughest possible water quality regulations, but also continuing to boost existing levels of spending on support for landholders alongside that. But the elephant in the room, as always, is that it honestly makes no difference what we do with reef water quality if climate change isn't brought under control, and that's the plain fact. We could do all we like. We could have crystal clear water going out onto the reef, and if we don't manage to keep average global climate temperature increases below 2 degrees of warming, we will lose the reef, just like every reef across the world. And I have to say, I still find it really quite disappointing that the report that laid bare the current state of that science, the IPCC's 1.5 degree report, I'm still not aware of anyone having raised that in Parliament, and the very clear threat that that it identified for that difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. So look, we've seen, others have mentioned already that the last 3 years have seen extraordinary damage to the reef through both bleaching and poor water quality. We've got an incredible amount of work to do to try and protect against any future degradation. And let's face it, if we don't deal with climate change, if we don't stop our continuous export of enormous amounts of thermal coal and of gas in particular, then the reef has no future.
Michael, I might ask you to start on the second question as well, which is essentially about climate change. Queenslanders are on the front line of climate change. Limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is crucial to protect our environment, to protect our own futures. And that's according to, consensus of scientists working on climate and the environment. So, I mean, what are the Greens going to do to ensure that Queensland does its fair share to keep global warming to relatively safe levels?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Look, I mean, I've gone some way to touching on that already, but the science is crystal clear. We simply don't have another 4 decades, to wait while politicians figure out whether or not we're prepared to upset the fossil fuel billionaires, whether it's Clive Palmer or Gautama Adani. We need immediately an ambitious plan and the determination to make it happen, and that's what the Greens have put forward. So we've proposed 100% publicly owned renewable energy in Queensland by 2030, which will create jobs that we can rely on rather than the sorts of boom and bust and the exposure that our coal communities have to the whims of the international market. So our plan means really significant government investment in actually building clean energy, including pumped hydro and battery storage that we know we need to create a comprehensive energy system. We've estimated that a full rollout by 2030 would create 23,000 jobs. But again, it also requires that orderly phase out of existing coal power stations with time to plan for the future of those communities rather than just leaving them in the cold. Obviously, again, I'll mention that we need no new coal and gas. We cannot keep digging up, we can't keep opening new reserves and exporting them. And that's directly factored into our plan to raise royalties on all mining companies. We need to come up with a plan for a just transition again for those communities, both in the generation space and in the mineral resources space, because we've got to be honest that those coal communities, whether it's in generation or in the mining communities, they have sacrificed a lot for this, for the state we live in now and for the quality of life that we enjoy. And it's so vital that they get the support they need, rather than we need to accept that thermal coal markets are in decline globally. And, we certainly shouldn't be doing anything to try and, reverse that trend. We need to be supporting communities through the transition and doing all we can to accelerate the global transition away from fossil fuels. So look, I mean, there's plenty more I could say on that. We're really interested in decarbonising our transport system as rapidly as we can. We've proposed, free public transport for everyone in Queensland. And we obviously need to boost the amount that we're, the incentives we're providing for electric vehicles, particularly through the government fleet. That seems like a really easy way to do that. And just one last point, we also see plenty of scope to revitalise manufacturing in Queensland by actually government investing directly in facilities to manufacture our own solar hardware, whether that's solar panels, renewables hardware, so solar panels or wind turbines. We've proposed factories in Townsville and in Rockhampton. And there's an incredibly bright future for green steel as well. It's a whole different conversation. But yeah, we need to get there and transition away from fossil fuel-based steel production too.
Shadow Minister, I'll throw this one to you. What's the LNP's plan to ensure Queensland does its fair share to keep global warming to relatively safe levels?
Well, by meeting the national targets. First and foremost, that's what we should do. And how do we do that? Well, we allow our generators to mandate them to invest in renewables. But if you want something that's big and bold, well, Deb's outlined the largest hydro plant through the Bradfield scheme ever seen in this state. And that's enough hydropower to power 800,000 homes. Now, that's big and it's bold and it's long term, but that's visionary. Now, Michael raised the idea about mining for minerals that are important to drive the next wave of technology. Another thing COVID's shown us is the importance of manufacturing local. Great opportunity for Queensland going forward. There's no need to demonise the mining industry. We should be providing certainty where those kinds of minerals can be used to drive the next wave. It can be done. But if you're asking what our key response is to make sure that we meet Paris, exceed Paris, and sign on as a state. We should be doing our bit.
Thank you, Shadow Minister, and Minister. Now, your response. So, what's Labor going to do to ensure that we limit warming to 1.5 degrees?
Well, thank you so much, Ben. And of course, fundamentally, what we need is some leadership from the federal LNP government on climate change. Without that, we are really, pushing a really hard target. And hard work on behalf of the Queensland government. We're doing the heavy lifting in this space. We need that federal government to step up and take on some leadership around climate change and policy in that space. Some of the things that Michael's just mentioned, are not new ideas. Palaszczuk government's already doing much of that already in terms of, we established CleanCo, a publicly owned entity to look at clean energy. We've invested, as I've already said in my opening remarks, $500 million to establish a clean energy fund. We've already committed $145 million for 3 clean energy zones. These are things that we are already doing. But of course, we need to continue to ensure that there's more into the future. The work that we've been doing with local councils around the QCOAST 2100, understanding that there'll be a little bit of work to catch up on to do whilst the rest of the world and while the federal government catches up on their leadership responsibilities around climate change and emissions targets, to ensure that we're able to create those havens for various species. That's why the protected area strategy is so important in that space, a 10-year plan to be able to support our protected area estate going forward. But, just on what David had to say about the resources sector, absolutely. The resource sector and the jobs that it supports has always been and will always be a critical part of our economy, and it'll be part of our renewable stories going forward. But, for a long time, I've been thinking about how do we ensure that we're able to, do that work. And of course, we have to have the strongest environmental protections we can to be able to do that work to sustain the resources sector into the future. And for a long time, I've been thinking about, how do we make sure that that's, something that we can do in a really balanced way. I've had many conversations with the conservation sector about the role of the regulator and the policy arm of the department. And can I say there are many staff members from the Department of Environment Science who are watching today, and I want to say a huge thank you to all of their incredibly hard work that they've been doing I've been pushing them very hard to be able to have the achievements that I was able to list earlier on. You know, what we should be looking at for Queensland going forward is, you know, considering the establishment of an independent environmental protection agency. We're the only state in the country that doesn't have an EPA, and that's something that I think would help us to be able to strengthen our ability to regulate those strongest environmental protections that we have here in this state, and to support all parts of our economic story going forward. You know, this is the potential to be able to improve the assessment and approval of projects, to ensure those strong environmental protections. It's not a case of wanting more bureaucracy, of course. This is about wanting to make the system better. And that's why, you know, when stakeholders have told me that they think the regulator should be separate from the policy-making arm of the department, I think that there's a real strong case for that, which is why considering that establishment of the EPA is something that I think we should be doing into the future.
Thanks very much, Minister. We're going to have to really move on because we are running out of time here, but I just wanted to very, very quickly probe on, I mean, you spoke there about the need to kind of balance the interest of the mining sector potentially in the environment. I mean, at some point, we need a recognition, don't we, that balance needs to tip in favour of environmental protection or climate protection in order to meet our climate goals. And it doesn't seem like either of the major parties is willing to kind of put a date on when that tipping point arrives, or really sort of start to push it. So I don't know whether either you, Minister, or Shadow Minister has a response to that, whether you can see the state moving more quickly towards trying to meet its climate goals.
Well, I'm happy to go first. And of course, you know, this continues to be a conversation that I've been having with conservation groups and other stakeholders in this space. There are many people who are interested in this conversation going forward. I think, you know, certainly in terms of the resource sector, we know that it's an important part of our economy. And I've been a huge advocate for what I've been calling the thriving balance, to be able to ensure that we can protect the environment and also grow jobs. And quite frankly, you know, from what I've heard even today, the Labor Party is the only one that can do both of those things. That's why the Climate Action Plan that will really focus on the next 10 years, the kinds of things that we need to be able to do to meet our targets. You know, zero net emissions by 2050. We've got a target at 2030 to see a 30% reduction in emissions. These targets are able to be supported by the Climate Action Plan. We've done a lot of research. We've got a lot of projects that are underway now that are proving some of this work. And I think a Climate Action Plan over the next 10 years will really outline all of that.
Thank you, Minister. I'm just sorry, I'm really going to have to cut you off. We're starting to run quite short of time. Just Shadow Minister, just did you have a comment that you wanted to make with regard to the, you know, the need to, you know, we're going to reach a tipping point here where we do need to start talking about winding back on coal-fired power generation, for instance. I mean, does the LNP have a plan beyond then, you know, I guess a genuine transition plan?
And to be part of a national solution and a global solution. But you made the comment in your introduction to the Minister about the state effectively going it alone. And I'm sorry to verbally, if that wasn't the words you used, but effectively the state going over and above that national agreement. Well, all that will do is you make a political point that puts your economy at the altar of disintegration. Now, what we need to do is have a strong economy that allows a transition to a more renewable future. That is the balance that must be found. Now, people can tell you all sorts of things, and they can make all sorts of ridiculous claims about one state doing something on its own and stopping things at a certain date. But unless you have a sustainable transition process, it is not achievable. And in the end, that will see people out of work, and it will see an economy that you can't afford to be able to support a sustainable environment. I believe there is a transition that can occur. I believe that Australia must play a global leadership role on that, and Queensland as a resource state needs to be front and centre, but there's no point making a political point that won't deliver a real and tangible environmental point. That's the sort of balance that I think needs to be found.
Thanks, Shadow Minister. I'm going to really have to move on quickly. I'm going to have to ask you for these next couple of questions to try and limit your responses because there are some areas we want to go through. Shadow Minister, I will ask you first because you mentioned land clearing in your opening statement. Queensland's responsible for more deforestation and land clearing than any other state. It's clear that a combination of strong laws, money and market incentives is needed to stop and reverse deforestation. I mean, do you accept that we have a deforestation problem, and what's the LNP going to do about it?
Clearly by the numbers, we've got a lot of work to do, Ben, and I think we can do it. And in my mind, it's a combination of finding a planning scheme that works. You've still got to protect people's use rights. Everybody's got use rights. But if a block of land is so significant, it's up to the government to step in and make that purchase for the benefit of all. But there's also the agricultural sector, and I don't believe we have worked as effectively with them as other places across the globe. That gives us an opportunity to genuinely not just lock away land, but genuinely protect it and improve it and foster it. I think there is a better way forward, and judge me in the future on those numbers. Judge me in what we can create in terms of protected areas, both as the government leading, but also working with our agricultural custodians.
Thanks. And Michael, on land clearing, what's the Greens policy? Where do we need to go?
Yeah, look, it's absolutely vital that we maintain the laws we have in place, and obviously I have some concerns about any prospect that the LNP might repeal any part of these really vitally important habitat protections. But I suppose maybe my greatest fear is that continuing to treat this issue like a political football, it generates the worst of all outcomes. It means that there's uncertainty for the ag sector, knowing that laws are just going to change. It means that each time a commitment's made to tighten up the laws as the pendulum swings back and forth, panic clearing is the inevitable outcome. And we just see, so much worse of an outcome with this constant toing and froing. I would say though that I do think there are gaps that we need to address that have been left by the last round of reform. So most importantly, the existing legislation leaves 23 million hectares of Queensland vegetation completely unregulated. It's category X. We need to deal with that. We've got concerns that the VMA still provides exemptions for activities relating to urban development and the resource sector. We think this needs to change. And look, there is, again, similar to the reef water quality situation, there's plenty more we could do to properly invest in incentives of financial support for sustainable agriculture and land management practices across the state.
Okay, thanks. And Minister, obviously Labor legislated in relation to land clearing, but I mean, what's next? Is there another step that you can...
Look, I'll just keep my comment really short. We reintroduced very sensible land vegetation management laws to end broad-scale tree clearing in this state. Mr. Berkman moved amendments to water down those laws, unfortunately. And what I can say about the former LNP government, when they first came back into office, they got rid of the vegetation management laws, and we saw the equivalent of 1,000 football fields a day being cleared in this state. That's why the vegetation management laws are so important, and that's why we will uphold them at every cost.
Thanks very much, Minister. Look, a final question, and again, if we can try and keep our answers as brief as possible, because we only have a few moments left, but I want to ask about taking better care of our national parks and protected areas on private land. So this question's from Walkley, who's a nature refuge holder on the Gold Coast. Look, all of your parties have expressed an ambition to meet or exceed global targets of 17% of the state as protected area. And what are you going to do to commit the funding needed to expand and better manage Queensland's protected area estate and reach those targets? So Michael, we might start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I mean, look, this is one area where, I mean, I can say straight up front that we fully support QCC's priorities that they've recently published when it comes to protected areas, and we're going to continue to advocate for these. And we know just how far short of the international benchmark we are. And also, it's not just the actual area, but making sure that in outback areas, the national parks are actually representative of those ecosystems, to ensure that we've got the diversity amongst the protected area estate that we should be aiming to. Look, I guess I was a little disappointed to see that the government's recently announced protected area strategy didn't include the sorts of measurable targets that we need, and did fall well short of the $135 million funding commitment that the QCC and others have been pushing for. But I also think it's important to, I mean, a lot of us might have missed, the Queensland Treasury Corporation did a report just a couple of years back, which said that even those targets are far below what we need. Even that their analysis, and this is in a report that I think the government made some effort to bury, they actually we need to invest something more like $220+ million, $220 million of capital investment to get to just 14% of the state and protected areas estate. And in addition to that, the cost of, you know, the ongoing costs to ensure that we're looking after the parks properly is more like $25 to $80 million a year. So it's a huge investment. This is a big amount of money. And we know that parks return an enormous amount economically to the state. But if we're going to see the estate expand to the extent that the targets say it should, and if we're going to see it maintained, then we do need to see, like, this is the sort of funding that we can only get if we're actually prepared to make, you know, big mining, the big banks, the big developers across Queensland pay a fairer share to put back into the natural environment.
Thanks, Michael. And Shadow Minister, the LNP's plans for protected areas?
Well, Ben, Michael's right when he says the amount falls short. And perhaps most troubling is this year, this current financial year, just gone, we spent just $1.5 million on acquiring parks in this state. You're not going to meet any targets doing that. That's not even close to making a dent in it. Now, we can talk about all the budgets we like, but we need to change the culture where we actually get in and roll up our sleeves and do it. Now, the initial premise of your question was about maintaining national parks. We're at about 50% of that allocation that we've spent so far year to date again. Now, this is culturally important. You cannot have a situation where people right now who border national parks believe that the worst neighbour you can possibly have is the state government, because between feral animals and feral pigs, they run amok. I intend to change that culture. We are absolutely committed to doing it properly. There is a role for First Australians to play in this as well. I have an ambitious strategy, and I look forward to announcing how we're going to increase the protected areas in the days to come. This is going to be an environmental legacy that I sincerely look forward to being involved in. And again, I come back to the premise of where I started. I look forward to working with the respective groups here to find out where the best parcels are, what they look like, and how to get best bang for our buck in terms of keeping them pristine. Because right now we've let our guard down both on acquisitions and on effective maintenance, and that's a failure on both fronts.
Thanks very much. And Minister, I guess the last comment to you. We've just seen a protected area strategy that's been, I guess, a long time coming. Does our target for those areas need to be more aggressive, and do we need to be, putting more funding behind it?
Yeah, so can I just start by really acknowledging, all of the rangers that work so hard in all of our national park estates, and all of the First Nations, Indigenous land and sea rangers, of which we've just announced that we'll be doubling across Queensland to 200. They do an incredible amount of work to ensure that our national parks are well maintained, let me tell you. The Palaszczuk government has expanded the estate by 1.2 million hectares since we've come to office. As you said, we established and have delivered a protected area strategy, a 10-year plan with a $60 million down payment. That's these $28 million worth of strategic acquisitions, $8 million to expand and support private protected areas. And let me tell you, we also established nation-leading special wildlife reserves, this multi-leveled way of being able to expand protected area and to protect it. This work is incredibly important, And that's why the protected area strategy is such a very important plank of how we ensure that we are expanding and protecting and maintaining our national parks.
Thanks so much, Minister. Look, we are now out of time, but Minister, I do really need to just very quickly probe on something that you'd said earlier. You talked about establishing an EPA. I mean, is that a promise from Labor in the next term? Are we going to see an EPA, or is this something we're sort of thinking about?
Yeah, well, I can say that it's a commitment to investigating and consulting on the establishment of an EPA going forward. Is something that people have been talking to me for a long time about, something that I've been thinking about a long time. But of course, there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of consultation, a lot of working out exactly what that might look like for Queensland to make it as simple as possible to be able to ensure that we've got the strongest protections that we've got and that we can be able to support projects going forward as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Minister. Look, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We have a lot of questions, particularly some suggestions that we should talk about Toondah Harbour. We're very sorry that we haven't been able to get to everyone's question today. If you did hear anything that you think may influence your vote, if you can answer the poll question that's coming up now, that would be fantastic. And look, if there is something that you do want to talk to our MPs, our Minister, Shadow Minister, and Michael, a member for Maiwar, really encourage you to get in touch with them, get in touch with your local member, and try and participate that way. Again, very sorry that we haven't been able to get to everyone's questions here today. Really like to acknowledge the organisations hosting the event, the Australian Marine Conservation Society, the Australian Conservation Foundation, the Wilderness Society, Our Living Outback, WWF Australia, and the Queensland Conservation Council. And in particular, thank Minister Enoch, Shadow Minister Crisafulli, and Mr. Berkman for joining us today. On the Queensland Conservation Council website, you can find more information about the issues we discussed here today, including an environmental agenda for the next Queensland government. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.